Sarah Thompson was a woman who had spent her life cultivating an image of success. A seasoned finance executive, she had long been accustomed to the luxuries that came with her status. Every business trip she took was meticulously planned, with first-class flights being the only option she ever considered. To Sarah, first class wasn't just a seat on a plane. It was a symbol of her achievements, her place in the world. She prided herself on the comfort and exclusivity that came with her lifestyle, finding solace in the predictability of it all: priority boarding, a glass of champagne, and the subtle hum of business conversations around her. Today, she was at New York's bustling international airport, heading to Los Angeles for yet another important meeting. She was used to the process, the calm, controlled environment of the first-class lounge, the smooth glide of her designer carry-on behind her as she walked confidently toward her gate. But as she approached her assigned seat, she felt her stride falter. There, already seated beside her, was a man she didn't expect. His appearance was far from what she had anticipated in the coveted first-class cabin. He was dressed simply in a navy blue suit, no ostentation, no flair. His presence exuded a quiet confidence as his eyes remained fixed on the laptop screen in front of him. It was a stark contrast to the polished professionals she was used to sharing this space with. Sarah's lips tightened, and she set her tote down with a little more force than intended. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an immediate sense of unease. Sarah's discomfort only grew as she stood there, surveying the man sitting next to her. He appeared to be lost in his work, his fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys of his laptop, his face a picture of concentration. His calm, composed demeanor irritated her. This was her space, her domain. It wasn't just any ordinary seat, it was first class. She had always associated first class with a certain level of exclusivity, with people of her caliber, and certainly not with someone like him. Her eyes scanned the cabin, searching for something to reassure her that this was simply a mistake. But no, there was no flight attendant rushing over to correct the situation, no one stepping in to move the man. It was just her, standing there, feeling the weight of her annoyance build with each passing second. She took a deep breath, trying to regain control. She tried to ignore the growing feeling of irritation and discomfort. But when she finally sat down beside him, she couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. His presence, so calm and unbothered, seemed to make her even more agitated. Her purse, still resting on her lap, accidentally brushed against his armrest as she adjusted in her seat. He didn't flinch. No reaction. She tried again. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice polite but firm, her words carefully measured. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The man didn't look up. His fingers continued to move across the keys as if she hadn't spoken. "Yes," he said, his response short, direct, and without elaboration. Sarah's lips tightened, and she shifted in her seat, feeling the air around her thicken. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She wasn't the kind of person who let things slide. She was a woman used to getting what she wanted when she asked for it. Her gaze flicked towards the flight attendants, hoping one of them would notice the growing tension between her and the man beside her. Finally, she caught the eye of Emily, a young flight attendant who had been helping passengers a few rows ahead. Sarah subtly signaled her over, her patience wearing thin. Emily approached with her usual professional smile, the one that never seemed to waver, no matter the situation. As she reached Sarah's row, her eyes darted briefly toward the man beside Sarah, but she didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she focused on Sarah, her voice calm and warm. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Sarah forced a tight smile, her lips pulling back as she gave a small chuckle, trying to mask the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "I think there's been a little mix-up," she said, her voice sweet but edged with a tone of disapproval. "This gentleman here," Sarah motioned toward the man beside her. "I believe he's in the wrong seat." Emily's eyes flickered to the man, who, despite her words, hadn't even acknowledged the interruption. His attention remained fixed on his laptop screen, as if Sarah's complaint didn't even warrant his focus. Emily glanced at the passenger manifest from her tablet, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. After a brief moment, she looked up with a polite smile. "Actually, ma'am, Mr. Stokes is in his correct seat," she replied. "Your ticket shows 2A, and he's in 2B. Sarah blinked in disbelief, her mind struggling to process the response. "No, This can't be right. She thought she had made a mistake. Surely, there was no way this man belonged in her space. That's odd, she said, her voice coming out tight as she forced a laugh. Are you sure? I assumed. Her voice trailed off as she searched for some sort of validation. Emily, still smiling, remained unfazed. I'm sure, ma'am. Everything looks correct. Sarah's fingers curled around the armrest, and her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't happening. She wasn't used to being told she was wrong, especially in a setting like this. First class was supposed to be reserved for people who mattered, who fit in, and this man, well, he didn't fit the profile. Are you sure? Sarah asked again, her voice shaky but firm. She didn't want to give in, didn't want to accept this. She had flown countless times, always knowing what to expect. But this was different. This felt like an affront to her expectations. Emily gave a small nod, sensing Sarah's discomfort but holding her ground. Yes, ma'am. Everything is in order. Sarah exhaled sharply, her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned away, staring out of the window, trying to compose herself. Mistakes happen, right? But deep down, she wasn't convinced. This wasn't just a simple mix-up. No, this was something more. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she was helpless to change it. The man beside her had done nothing wrong, yet everything about his presence made her feel like her world was being disrupted. Meanwhile, Daniel, Mr. Stokes, as he was called, had already returned to his work, seemingly unaffected. His indifference stung, heightening Sarah's frustration. She couldn't bear it. She wasn't someone who could simply let things go. The weight of her discomfort and frustration pushed her into action again. She pressed the call button, her finger hovering over it for a moment before she pressed it firmly. This wasn't right. Emily returned a few moments later, still as composed as ever. Is there something else I can assist you with? She asked, her voice still smooth and polite. Sarah, eyes narrowed in quiet defiance, didn't hesitate. She needed to feel heard, to feel like someone understood her frustration. This was not how things were supposed to go. Sarah's frustration was beginning to reach its peak. She was no longer able to focus on the flight attendants walking past or the hum of the air conditioning in the cabin. Every little sound, every movement seemed to make her more aware of the growing tension beside her. Daniel, the man she couldn't shake from her mind, was seated there so calmly, so unbothered. It was maddening. She was accustomed to control, to the predictability of her high-powered life, where things always fell into place. But here, in this small, confined space, her well-ordered world felt as though it was crumbling. She had always been in charge, always been the one who made the decisions, and yet, in this moment, she felt utterly powerless. Her fingers tapped impatiently against the armrest, each tap echoing the rapid beating of her heart. The situation had dragged on too long. She couldn't simply sit there and do nothing. There had to be something she could do, something to restore order to her chaotic emotions. She glanced around the cabin again, looking for a flight attendant to make her request clear, hoping one would understand her discomfort. But none seemed to notice. They went about their duties, unaware of her mounting frustration. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight with anxiety. Sarah felt trapped in a situation she couldn't control. Daniel, still absorbed in his work, hadn't even looked up since Emily confirmed he was in the right seat. He had no idea what was happening inside her mind. No one does, she thought bitterly. But her irritation was only growing, and the thought of sitting next to him for the rest of the flight was unbearable. With a sudden decision, Sarah reached for the call button once more. The chime echoed in the quiet cabin, but this time, Emily hesitated. When she arrived, her expression was slightly more strained, a hint of tension creeping into her usual calm demeanor. "Ma'am?" she asked, keeping her voice polite but wary. "I'd like to request a seat change," Sarah said flatly, trying to keep her tone as neutral as possible. She wasn't going to sugarcoat it anymore. She couldn't pretend that she was fine with the situation. She wasn't. Emily blinked. "Oh, are you uncomfortable? Is there an issue with the seat itself?" she asked, looking at Sarah with mild concern. Sarah hesitated for a moment. She could have said it was the seat, that it was the way it reclined or the armrest being too high, but that would have been a lie. The issue wasn't with the seat. The issue was with the person sitting next to her, with the man who had invaded her space, her sense of comfort, without a word of apology or acknowledgement. "No, it's not the seat," Sarah replied, her voice sharp. She faltered for a moment, trying to find the right words. I just don't feel comfortable sitting here. She let the words hang in the air, as if hoping they would be enough to convey the depth of her dissatisfaction. Emily paused, looking at Sarah with the same professional smile. I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. Let me check if there are any open seats. Sarah exhaled, watching Emily walk away. Her thoughts were racing, her mind swirling with all the reasons she couldn't possibly sit there any longer. She didn't belong next to him. She didn't want to share the space with someone like him. She was better than this. But even as she thought it, a small, nagging voice inside her whispered that it wasn't just about the man. It was about control, about needing things to go the way she expected them to. And right now, nothing was going the way she wanted. Sarah's patience had worn thin. She could feel the frustration radiating from her chest, her fingers clenched tightly around the armrest. Each second that passed felt like an eternity as Emily disappeared to check on the seating arrangements. Sarah could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, though no one dared to intervene. A few rows ahead, a man in a blazer had subtly turned his head to glance at her. Across the aisle, a woman nudged her husband and whispered, clearly not as discreet as she thought. Sarah hated the feeling of being watched, as if her every move was under scrutiny. She was used to being in control, to making things happen with just a word. But here, in this cramped cabin, she felt utterly powerless. The minutes dragged on, and each one added to her unease. She could see Daniel out of the corner of her eye, still immersed in his work, typing away without any concern for the growing tension in the air. It was as though he didn't care about her discomfort at all, and that infuriated her even more. He didn't even seem to notice her, didn't see the inconvenience he was causing her. How could he not care? When Emily returned, her expression was polite, but there was a hint of tension in her eyes. She carried herself with professionalism, but it was clear that she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. I'm afraid we're at full capacity today, ma'am, she said. There aren't any open first-class seats available. Sarah's mind raced. Full capacity? That can't be right. She had been expecting a solution, a way out, but Emily's words felt like a wall crashing down on her plans. Her stomach twisted. She had nowhere to go. She had no other choice but to stay in her assigned seat beside the man she couldn't stand. Emily's voice was still polite, but Sarah could hear the growing frustration beneath it. Would you like me to check in economy? There might be a seat available there. Economy? The thought of it made Sarah's skin crawl. The very idea of sitting in economy, far away from the comforts and luxury she was used to, felt like an insult. She opened her mouth to object, but no words came out. She had been prepared to be treated like a VIP, to have her needs met with the utmost care. But here she was, at the mercy of a system that didn't care about her status, her money, or her comfort. I don't want to sit in economy, Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. That's not going to work. Emily's smile didn't falter, but there was something about it now. It wasn't the warmth of service anymore. It was professional detachment. In that case, Emily said, I hope you don't mind staying in your assigned seat, ma'am. Sarah's mind raced again. She wasn't going to accept this. She couldn't. I just don't feel comfortable sitting here, she repeated, her voice a little louder now. She wasn't going to back down. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were empty. The man beside her, Daniel, still hadn't reacted. He wasn't looking at her, wasn't responding to her obvious discomfort. He was just there, and it made her feel small. She didn't know how to make him understand, how to make him leave. As Sarah continued to stew in her thoughts, the whispers around her grew louder. She could feel the tension building in the cabin. A few passengers glanced at her, then back at Daniel. She was the center of attention, but not in the way she had hoped. They were watching, waiting for something. They could sense her unease. And the thought of them judging her, of them seeing her as unreasonable, made her even more irritable. It was at that moment, when Sarah was about to press the call button again, that the unexpected happened. Daniel's fingers stopped typing. Slowly, he closed his laptop and looked up. His eyes met hers, calm, unwavering, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Without a word, he reached into the pocket of his jacket. Sarah watched, her heart beating faster as he pulled out a leather case and flipped it open. Inside, gleaming in the soft overhead light, was a gold FBI badge. Everything stopped. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The air in the cabin shifted. The murmurs from the passengers died down. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. FBI? The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The man she had been trying to get removed from the plane wasn't just anyone. He was federal law enforcement. Daniel's voice was calm, even polite, but there was an undeniable sharpness to it now. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, tilting his head slightly. "Would you like to file an official complaint? I can take your statement right now." Sarah's mouth went dry. The words caught in her throat. She had no idea how to respond. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, a way to get out of this nightmare, but nothing came. The man she had tried to dismiss, the man she had so carelessly tried to have removed, was now a federal agent. And now, it was her turn to feel trapped. The cabin was silent. Everyone was waiting for her response. But no one spoke, not even Emily. The silence in the cabin was palpable. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. The realization hit her like a brick. The man she had been so desperate to have removed from first class wasn't just any ordinary passenger. He was an FBI agent. His badge, gleaming in the light, was a symbol of power, authority, and responsibility. And now, in front of the entire cabin, she had to face the consequences of her actions. She felt the eyes of the passengers on her, some curious, others judgmental. The tension was thick, the air charged with an uncomfortable electricity. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to process what had just happened. How had she gotten here? She had been so sure that she was in the right, that her discomfort should have been enough to warrant a change. But now, everything had backfired in a way she couldn't have predicted. Daniel didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His presence, his calm demeanor, and the weight of his badge spoke volumes. He simply waited, his eyes locked onto hers, as if daring her to continue. But Sarah couldn't. The words she had been ready to say, the accusations, the demand for a change of seats, all of it died in her throat. She felt as if she were suffocating under the weight of her own humiliation. The cabin was still. The passengers who had been whispering before, exchanging curious glances, were now silent, their attention focused entirely on Sarah. The woman with the phone, who had been recording everything from the beginning, zoomed in on Sarah's face, her camera capturing the raw, unspoken discomfort. The small ripple of movement, the soft murmur of the passengers, was now an overwhelming tide of judgment. And Sarah, the woman who had always prided herself on her ability to control any situation, felt utterly exposed. A soft chuckle came from 2 rows ahead. A man in a blazer shook his head, his expression one of amusement mixed with disbelief. He muttered something under his breath, unbelievable, and a few passengers laughed quietly. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment, her stomach churning as she realized how thoroughly she had lost control of the situation. Her mind raced. How could this be happening? She had simply asked for a seat change. But now, everything she had said, everything she had tried to do, seemed like a colossal mistake. The video of her interaction with Daniel was already circulating. The caption was simple, but damning. Racist woman tries to remove black man from first class, then learns he's FBI. The weight of her own actions was crushing. The passengers around her had already seen it. They had already judged her. She couldn't hide from this. The evidence was already out there. She couldn't take it back. And yet, no one seemed to care about her explanation, about the reasons behind her discomfort. The video, the comments, the laughter, it was all a reminder that in the age of social media, everything could be captured and shared in an instant, with no way to undo the damage. Daniel closed his badge slowly, tucking it back into his jacket pocket with a sense of finality. Without another word, he opened his laptop and resumed typing, as though the incident had never happened. To him, it was just another moment in a long day. But for Sarah, it was the moment that would change everything. The cabin's focus shifted back to their own business, the conversation resuming quietly as the flight continued its journey. But for Sarah, it was over. The humiliation, the embarrassment, it had all been laid bare. And now, as she sat in her seat, staring straight ahead, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah's pulse raced as she sat frozen in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The moment she had feared most was unfolding right before her eyes. The video had already begun to spread. The woman sitting across from her, phone still in hand, had captured every single moment, every word, every glance. every slight of her discomfort. Sarah could feel the weight of the phone's camera lens on her, even though she knew it was only a matter of time before the video hit social media. The young woman's phone, held slightly angled upward, told Sarah everything she needed to know. She was the next viral sensation, but not in the way she had imagined. The thoughts spun through Sarah's mind like a whirlwind. What had I done? Her stomach twisted into knots, and her mouth went dry. The more she thought about it, the more the reality of the situation hit her. The video was already online, and it was spreading quickly. The passengers around her were no longer the friendly faces she had once associated with first-class travel. Instead, they were silent observers, some still trying to hide their phones, some whispering among themselves, but all aware of the incident that had just unfolded. A low chuckle came from a few rows ahead. One of the men, who had been pretending to read his newspaper earlier, now shook his head, muttering under his breath. "Karma's a bitch," he said, his voice carrying just loud enough for Sarah to hear. She wished she could vanish into the seat, make herself invisible. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the weight of the attention she had garnered. Her phone buzzed violently in her purse. Sarah jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. It was a message, then another, then a third. She could only imagine what they were about to say. As she pulled the phone out, her fingers trembling, she saw a string of text messages from friends and family. The first few were from people she hadn't heard from in years, all with the same urgent tone. "Is this you?" She clicked open one of the messages, and her stomach dropped. The video was everywhere. It had already been shared on Twitter, Facebook, and multiple group chats. The caption was short but damning. "Racist woman tries to remove black man from first class, then learns he's FBI." The views were ticking up by the second. 30,000, 50,000, 80,000. It was spreading faster than she could comprehend. The comments were rolling in like a tidal wave. She couldn't keep up with the flood of negativity. Wow, entitled much? How does she not know better? Instant karma. The words stung with every swipe. She had always considered herself a respected professional, someone with a reputation built on years of hard work. But now, that reputation was crumbling before her eyes. Sarah glanced up briefly, but no one around her seemed willing to help. The flight attendants, who had once been so helpful, now regarded her with a cool detachment. Emily, the flight attendant who had been so polite before, had a different look in her eyes now. She wasn't scolding Sarah or even offering sympathy. She simply looked through her, as if she had already passed judgment. The humiliation weighed heavier with each passing minute. Sarah realized that her entire world, the carefully curated life she had built for herself, was about to come crashing down. There was no way to undo this. The video was already out there, circulating like wildfire. Every attempt to explain herself, to justify her actions, would fall on deaf ears. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked at Daniel, but he was still engrossed in his laptop, seemingly unaffected by the chaos he had unknowingly caused. He didn't even know what had happened after he revealed his FBI badge. He hadn't anticipated that his calm demeanor would expose Sarah's true nature. But now, as the video spread, everyone would know who she really was. The woman who tried to have a black man removed from first class. The flight still hadn't taken off, but Sarah already felt like she had lost everything. The descent into chaos was swift. Sarah's phone buzzed incessantly, the vibration almost sending her into a state of panic. She looked down at it, her hands shaking as she tried to make sense of the flood of notifications. More texts, more calls, each one more urgent than the last. The video was everywhere, and there was no way to stop it now. She had been exposed in front of the entire world, and the shame that followed felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some sympathetic, some indifferent, and others openly mocking her. One man, 2 rows ahead, had muttered something under his breath. She couldn't make out the words, but the sneer on his face was enough. Her face flushed with humiliation, her body tense with embarrassment. There was nowhere to hide. No safe space where she could escape the judgment that was flooding in from all sides. A few seconds later, another notification pinged, and Sarah's heart sank. It was a message from her boss, James Rollins, the chair of the Marston Foundation, a prominent charity she had been a part of for years. She didn't even need to open it to know what it was about. Her breath hitched as her thumb hovered over the message. With a deep breath, She opened it. "Patricia, we need to have a conversation. Please call me immediately." Sarah's stomach twisted as she read the words. She had been on the board of the Marston Foundation for years, proud of her involvement in an organization that championed inclusivity, equality, and community outreach. But now, her actions had shattered the very ideals she had represented. She knew what was coming. The message had no need to elaborate. She had already crossed the line. She pressed her finger to the screen, dialing James's number. Her mind raced. How could this have happened? What could she even say to him? Her hands trembled as the phone rang, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the line clicked, and James's voice came through, cold and sharp. "Patricia." James's voice was calm, but it carried a weight of finality. "I'm sure you're aware of the situation. I've seen the video. It's all over the internet." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. "James, I'm going to have to ask you to step down from the board, effective immediately," he interrupted. The words hit her like a slap in the face, and she had to fight the urge to crumble. "The board has already discussed it. We can't have someone representing us who behaves in such a manner. We'll be issuing a public statement by morning. Your resignation is expected by then." Her hands trembled as she clenched the phone tighter. The world she had so carefully built was crumbling around her. The career she had worked so hard to create, the reputation she had nurtured over decades, it was all falling apart. "But James, this is being taken out of context. You don't understand," she tried to explain, her voice shaking. "No." James's voice was firm now, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This is no longer a matter of context. It's about your actions. The foundation can't afford to be associated with behavior like that. I'm sorry, but you'll need to resign. We'll make the announcement shortly." The words felt like a knife twisting in her gut. She couldn't argue. There was no point in trying to salvage what was already lost. Her life, her career, her position in the foundation, everything she had worked for, was gone. James's voice softened slightly, but the finality remained. "I'm sorry, Patricia, but this is how it has to be." The line went silent, and Sarah's heart dropped as the call ended. She sat there, staring at her phone, feeling the weight of her mistakes crashing down on her. She wanted to scream, to protest, to deny everything. But deep down, she knew there was no denying it. The video had done its damage, and there was no coming back from it. As she put her phone down, Sarah felt the eyes of everyone around her once again. The passengers, the flight attendants, the young woman who had recorded everything, they all knew now. They all knew what she had done, and there was no escaping it. Her reputation was gone, and her career, what she had defined herself by for so long, was over. But Sarah wasn't the only one facing consequences. Daniel, the man she had tried to remove, had walked away without so much as a second glance. He hadn't even looked back at her. The thought made her stomach churn. He had moved on, unbothered, while she was left to pick up the pieces of a life she had taken for granted. The plane still hadn't taken off, but in her mind, everything had already crashed down. As the plane continued its slow taxiing toward the runway, Sarah sat motionless, her mind numb. The crash of her career and reputation felt just as heavy as the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. There was no turning back. Her phone, now silent, felt like an anchor at the bottom of a sea she couldn't escape. The video was already viral, and there was no way to stop it. Her name was trending on social media, accompanied by comments she couldn't even bear to read. Her life, once carefully curated and controlled, had been upended in a matter of hours. And yet, as she sat there, she couldn't help but reflect on how easily it had all unraveled. Her discomfort, her assumption that she was entitled to a certain standard of service, had led her to treat another human being, an FBI agent, no less, like an intruder. Her own biases, which she had long buried beneath the veneer of professionalism, had come to the surface in the worst way possible. She had tried to justify her actions, but now, looking back, there was no excuse. The lesson was clear. In a world where actions are easily captured and shared, there is no room for entitlement, for thinking that certain people are less deserving of respect. Everyone, no matter their background, their job, or their appearance, deserved the same dignity. Sarah had been exposed, and the consequences were severe. Her arrogance had cost her everything. But in this moment of profound realization, she knew that the only way forward was to change, to truly learn from this experience. The question was, would she? Or would she continue to let her pride define her? The answer, only time would tell.